Boy posing as girl killed in Indianapolis. That was an actual headline. Printed in black and white. Broadcasted across televisions. Echoed in newsrooms. Read it again. What's wrong with this headline? A 17-year-old girl was brutally murdered. But instead of honoring her life, the media reduced her to a boy posing as a girl. As if her identity was a trick. As if her life was some kind of illusion. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a choice. A choice that shaped how the world saw Nireah Johnson. And maybe, how the world forgot her. So, let's go back. Let's tell the real story. Nireah Johnson was not a deception. She was a daughter. A friend. A teenager navigating life like any other girl her age. She had dreams, laughter, and a best friend named Brandy Coleman, a girl who accepted her, celebrated her, and never questioned who she was. That summer in 2003, they did what so many teenage girls do, hung out, talked about boys, and went on casual dates. But one night, a date turned into something far worse. A man named Paul Moore had been spending time with them, texting, talking, flirting. At first, everything seemed normal. But the moment he discovered Nireah was transgender, his interest turned into something dark. That night, he lured them into his SUV. What happened next was pure terror. A gunshot. Then another. By the time their bodies were found inside a burned-out vehicle, the media had already begun writing their version of the story. And just like that, Nireah was erased. Her name was buried under her dead name. Her identity was reduced to a boy in disguise. And worse, the crime wasn't even framed as a hate-fueled execution, it was painted as a misunderstanding. A man who felt deceived and reacted out of panic. But let's be clear, this wasn't panic. This was murder. And the media? They helped justify it. Words have power. They shape how we see the world. They tell us who to sympathize with, and who to blame. So when the media called Nireah Johnson a boy posing as a girl, they weren't just misidentifying her. They were stripping her of her truth. And more than that, they were shifting the narrative. Because let's be honest. If the headline had read "Teen Girl Murdered in Cold Blood," the public outrage would have been different. The conversation would have been about her, about the crime, the loss, the injustice. But instead, the story became about Paul Moore. About how he felt. About how he reacted. As if he were the victim. And that one choice, those few words, had consequences. Think about it. If someone is seen as an innocent girl, murdered for who she was, the crime is clear-cut. A tragedy. A hate crime. But if someone is painted as deceptive, as someone who lied about their identity, suddenly, the crime is complicated. Suddenly, people start asking the wrong questions. Did she trick him? Did he snap in the heat of the moment? Is this really murder, or just a tragic misunderstanding? This kind of framing is dangerous. Because it plants a seed of justification. And when violence against trans people is justified, it keeps happening. But don't take my word for it. Let's go back a year before Nireah's murder. A 17-year-old girl named Gwen Araujo was brutally beaten and strangled to death in California. Her killers? 4 men she had spent time with. The moment they discovered she was transgender, the night turned violent. And just like with Nireah, the media ran with the wrong story. Instead of focusing on the fact that Gwen was brutally murdered, headlines described her as a man in disguise. They called it the trans panic defense, the idea that these men were so shocked by Gwen's identity that they just lost control. And guess what? 2 of her killers were convicted of manslaughter, not murder. Because the jury was influenced by the idea that their reaction, their violence, was somehow understandable. Does that sound familiar? It should. Because history keeps repeating itself. And every time the media misgenders a victim, every time they frame trans identity as deception, they are setting the stage for the next tragedy. And the worst part? Even after 2 decades, it's still happening. When the news of Nireah Johnson's murder broke, something disturbing happened. People weren't talking about the crime. They weren't outraged that 2 teenagers had been shot in the back of a car, left to die, their lives cut short for no reason. No. They were debating her identity. Some headlines barely mentioned the crime itself, choosing instead to focus on who Nireah was, twisting the story into one about so-called deception. And just like that, the conversation shifted. Instead of asking, why did this happen, people started asking, was it justified? This isn't just about one case. This is a pattern. When a cisgender woman is murdered, the world mourns her. The media tells her story with sympathy. People demand justice. But when a transgender woman is murdered, the headlines focus on how she lived instead of how she died. They bring up irrelevant details about her past. They use the wrong name. They turn her murder into a debate instead of a tragedy. And that difference? It's deadly. Because if the media treats a crime like it's complicated, then so does the justice system. If society doesn't value a victim's life, neither will the people responsible for protecting it. We've seen it happen again and again. In 2019, Dana Martin, a black transgender woman, was found shot to death in Alabama. Police misgendered her in their reports. News outlets followed suit. And the result? No public outrage. No national conversation. Another name added to a growing list of lives lost and forgotten. This is why media bias isn't just about words. It's about life and death. When trans victims are misgendered in the press, it does more than erase them. It tells the world that their lives don't matter. And when society sends that message, violence continues unchecked. And the worst part? The cycle repeats. The media gets it wrong. The public reacts with apathy or blame. The justice system follows suit. And another life is lost. Who will be next? The way a story is told can be just as powerful as the story itself. When the media gets it wrong, they don't just misreport the facts, they shape public perception. They decide who deserves justice and who doesn't. Nireah Johnson's murder was a tragedy. But the way it was reported? That was an injustice of its own. Because the first thing the world learned about her wasn't that she was a victim. It was that she was deceptive. That she was somehow responsible for her own death. And that framing stuck. Compare that to a more recent case, Brianna Gay in the UK. Like Nireah, Brianna was a transgender teen whose life was stolen too soon. But when her story made headlines, the difference was clear. Her name was reported correctly. Her identity was respected. Her murder wasn't framed as a controversy. It was treated as a horrific crime, because that's what it was. The contrast is impossible to ignore. When Nireah was killed, the world questioned who she was. When Brianna was killed, the world demanded justice. And that's the power of journalism done right. So, has anything changed since Nireah's murder? Some progress has been made. Many media outlets have since updated their guidelines on reporting trans victims. Organizations like GLAAD have pushed for accountability, and in some places, misgendering in official reports is now being challenged. But change is slow. And for every step forward, there are still countless stories where trans victims don't get the respect they deserve. Because misinformation still happens. Police still misgender victims. Reporters still frame these murders as deception gone wrong. And as long as that continues, the cycle of violence will never end. So we have to ask ourselves, how many more lives will it take before the media stops fueling the fire? What happens when the truth gets buried? What happens when a victim isn't just forgotten, but rewritten? Nireah Johnson's life was stolen. But so was her story. And when the media failed her, they didn't just make a mistake. They sent a message: some lives matter. Others don't. But that message is a lie. Because every life matters. And when we let the truth get twisted, we don't just disrespect the dead, we endanger the living. Misrepresentation isn't just careless reporting. It's a weapon. When trans victims are misgendered, their deaths are dismissed. When they're erased from their own stories, the world stops caring. And when people stop caring, the violence continues. Think about this: how many more lives have to be taken before we demand better? Because this isn't just about Nireah. It's about every person like her, every trans woman who has ever been told that her existence is up for debate. We owe them more than silence. Here's the truth: we can't bring Nireah back. But we can stop this from happening again. That starts with holding the media accountable. Call out misrepresentation when you see it. Support ethical journalism by following organizations like GLAAD. Sign petitions that demand accurate reporting. And most importantly, keep these stories alive. Because once a name is forgotten, so is the fight for justice. Nireah Johnson was more than a headline. She was a daughter. A friend. A young woman who deserved to live. She wasn't the first to be erased. And if we don't act, she won't be the last. So ask yourself, what will you do to make sure no one else disappears?